Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 402 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, back to you with another week on training principles. Excited today to talk about the very common, and I think also the very commonly misunderstood, tempo workout. So we're going to be going over the next series of chapters, basically breaking down some of the subcomponents of training and digging into them and talking about the what and the why and the how, and perhaps the different types of, in this case, tempo workouts that you might do. So that's what today is all about. I think tempo is an interesting word in our sport because it can be used in a lot of different ways. And I think for that reason, it can sometimes be confusing because you might have that term used by one sort of training philosophy in one way, another training philosophy in a different way. And that's kind of the nature of coaching in a sense, where terms kind of get used slightly different ways. We're going to talk about how we mean it, and which I think is down the middle of what most commonly held perspectives is on the tempo world, but talk about how we use it and obviously how to execute on it, which tempo workouts are tricky to get right. But first, welcome James, my co-host. James, how are you?
I'm doing well. I was actually thinking, it's funny because you started with the idea that it's like often misunderstood, and I wonder if we should at least cover a couple of misunderstandings.
Sure.
I'm curious what you're thinking, because I just heard a recent one that I was like, what? It took like 30 minutes of a conversation before I realized we weren't using that term in the same way, you know?
Yeah, I mean, tempo is kind of like threshold, like you might hear that word used. And oftentimes people are talking about two different things when they're using the word threshold, because there are different types of threshold. And I think tempo gets assigned to different effort levels, depending on maybe the coach's perspective. And, for better or worse, that is what it is. I don't necessarily think people are wrong. Some people might be, but I don't think most people are wrong in using it. They just have slightly different labels, essentially. But yeah, I mean, the most common one in my head that I think about, and we'll kind of drill into this, is I think sometimes people use tempo and lactate threshold interchangeably. So that's one example, but what's the one you were talking about?
Yeah. And I might skew that way because I use it as an effort-based version. But I realized the other day that, and I was curious if you've heard this, but I was meeting with an athlete sitting in a coffee shop, and she used multiple times tempo runs, and she's casually referencing them. And it's such a common term in our world that I'm listening along and I'm filing away information through the conversation in hopes to arrive at some kind of helpful conclusion or point, only to realize we don't have the same definition the whole way through. And her simple representation of the word tempo, I realized, had more to do like the word tempo when you hear it in music. Like just basically our word for quality.
Okay.
Any run
Anything
that has
faster.
any kind of upbeat to it,
Got it.
any rhythm to it, is the way she was referencing the word tempo. And I thought, oh, wow, how many are out there?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like how many times it just made me, and I brought it all back together. But I was like, how many times have I been in a conversation saying like tempo, or someone saying, where do we add tempo runs? And I was like, hey, you don't always need a tempo run. Anyway, I just don't know if you've come across that where people refer to it more as rhythm.
I have not heard it used in that way, but that's interesting. So that's the broad definition, basically using it interchangeably with speed workout or quality workout. So it could mean anything. It could be fast intervals, slow intervals, tempo runs as we describe them. Well, that's interesting. So you're thinking, okay, wow, she's doing tempo all the time.
Yeah, well, at least for the majority of the conversation, then we clarified that. And I didn't tell her she was right or wrong. I simply was like, oh, what I meant by this was, okay, like, because, Anyway, I just thought it was so wild that I don't know, people pick up a term and just use it. I've had athletes do that with the word float. When we talked about float recoveries before, they used it interchangeably with recovery. And I was like, no, hold on. Last week I gave you an actual float recovery. I'm not talking float this week.
Right.
Anyway, I'm not trying to distract further.
Float is an honest effort recovery versus a shuffle jog recovery, right? But it does sound, can sound like, oh, I'm just kind of floating.
Floating with the tempo.
Like floating with the tempo. Let's confuse all the terms.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think commonly tempo is used interchangeably with some of the different threshold levels. And depending on your coach or your philosophy, you might hear it, refer to slightly different things in our world, it sits kind of bang in the middle of the two thresholds, which, to me, that's where we start is like, okay, well, what is tempo?
Mm-hmm.
And, from there, the question is, well, why do we use tempo effort? But I think it starts with the what. And what, the first thing about the what of tempo is that it is an effort. It is not a pace.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be associated commonly with certain paces that we use to help triangulate around the effort. But it is an effort, not a pace. Sort of message number one. Message number two is that tempo is commonly associated with aerobic strength. So basically staying power. We're all endurance runners. If you're listening to this podcast, you're trying to hold your pace for longer periods of time, be strong at the end of a half marathon, be strong at the end of a marathon, be strong at the end of a 5K when you're on the limit. And how do we build that? We build that by building endurance, and aerobic strength is a big component of that. It's that aerobic resilience, that aerobic staying power, that endurance. And so tempo is one of the building blocks for that. And there's different ways that we use it. Now, that's not to say tempo is only used in the aerobic strength phase. We'll talk about that later. There are applications in other phases. So it is something that really spans all phases of the training potentially. But that's one where it's primarily used. Is at least you're going to see more tempo workouts typically in that aerobic strength phase than others. But this is an effort that helps you build that. Now, the other part of this, in order to orient people around it, is I like to remind people what threshold is. And there are two types of thresholds that we primarily talk about. You have aerobic threshold and you have lactate threshold, also called anaerobic threshold. In our world, the way we think about it, tempo kind of sits in the middle. It's the effort in the middle. And so there's this spectrum from aerobic strength to aerobic threshold to lactate threshold, where you're essentially at a point where the body is producing higher level elevated levels of lactate, but it's able to discard or reuse that lactate in a helpful, productive way. At some point, once you pass over the lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold, then lactate starts to spiral out of control. And that's when the end becomes nearer. So working in this range is really important because it helps give you that staying power. On one end, you have aerobic threshold, which is essentially the point of the lactate curve where lactate starts getting produced in elevated levels, but it's such that the body can easily reuse it or discard it. Then you get to kind of the middle where the body's essentially kind of using and reusing and processing lactate efficiently and smoothly. It's creating basically as much as it's using or discarding. Mm-hmm. And then as you get closer to lactate threshold, you start to reach the limit. It starts to spiral a little bit and you're just on this side of control. And then once you go beyond lactate threshold, it spirals out of control. So we're working within that range. In our world, tempo primarily means that middle range where you're becoming really efficient at producing and using or discarding lactate in this equilibrium that you kind of find there. Mm-hmm. And so there's magic created in that space because you become really efficient at dealing with and using as fuel lactate. And it's important to understand, but it's important to understand that range. And there are some people that might use the word tempo to describe lactate threshold. That's a probably more common than not way that I've heard it used. We believe that it's sub kind of lactate threshold pace, and we'll use lactate threshold separately when we're talking about that. But that's kind of what we're talking about scientifically. What would you add?
I wouldn't add much because that's the key. I would just say that maybe to just shine more light on it. It was cool for me in my learning curve and learning process to realize that middle window you're actually recycling. Like I only grew up in like the high school days, and we cover this in the books, but like in the high school days, if you lifted hard or something, you were sore, you would just hear this term lactic acid. You're like, oh, the lactic. And so we started to associate it with something bad, like almost a consequence. And it is, quote, a byproduct of pushing. But the fact that there's a middle ground where we can hold it and recycle it and use it as fuel was just kind of enlightening and empowering. It helped me understand why we needed to do these kinds of runs and incorporate them and even put higher emphasis. It's like we talked about how important polarization was, like the extreme end of easy running all the way to strides on the polar opposite end. And this is like right in that middle, just like it's between the two thresholds.
And you're working here, but you have control. That's the important thing. It's definitely recognizable as doing work, but very much in control work. And if you go too far, once you start losing control, then you're beyond this happy tempo place. So I think everybody, should understand that spectrum from aerobic threshold to lactate threshold, because it's really, in many ways, it's the sweet spot of training for us endurance athletes. And also when you hear someone use the word tempo, if you might be switching coaches or you're talking to somebody just like you were talking to the person talking about tempo as speed workouts, make sure you clarify what they're referring to, because people have different ways of using it. And again, most of them aren't wrong. They're just different ways of labeling things. But that's hopefully helpful at determining how we label things. And so that's kind of the what and the why we've talked about as well. Integrated with that conversation is just about that aerobic resilience, that staying power, that ability to hold paces late in races, late in half marathons, late in even marathons, because you've spent time working on this zone. And we'll talk about it here in a second. But also this zone can be used in other ways. So yes, it's about building aerobic strength, but it can also be used potentially in the priming phase, which we'll talk about ways that's done. You can use it certainly in the race specific phase, because tempo effort is most closely associated for most people with half marathon pace. And so it's about what you can do to hold for a half marathon. And so, it might be used in that phase, not necessarily as a pure effort, but as a more pace-oriented work where you're trying to learn race-specific pacing. So there's different ways to use it. We'll talk about it as we go, but that's the what and the why. The next part of the book is, as my dog digs into the couch behind us, is the types of tempo workouts. And this is more sort of our specific flavor of how we do tempo, how we label different types of tempo workouts. There's kind of 4. So we're going to talk about those types, talk a little bit about examples of what they might look like, and then we'll go into where they fit, and then finish with a little bit on how to execute tempo workouts, because this is, I think, one of the harder workouts to get, types of workouts and effort zones to get right. It takes some learning and experience and developing that skill set. So 4 different types. In our vernacular, we're going to talk about the true tempo, which is probably the most commonly given tempo workout across coaching modalities. The broken tempo, perhaps my personal favorite, both as a coach and as an athlete. We've got some mixed tempo workouts where you're mixing in tempo with other things. And then we've got another type, which is the long tempo, so really long extended tempo runs, which is the least common and probably most advanced style of tempo workout, which we'll cover here in a second. So let's dig into each of these. The true tempo, which is kind of the most commonly prescribed tempo workout you might hear about, is typically 20 to 30 minutes, 3 to 4 miles, or some version within of just running tempo effort in the middle of a run. True tempo, simple tempo, whatever you want to call it. It's a short in air quotes, small in air quotes dose of tempo work that's like 3 to 4 miles.
Yeah.
So pretty straightforward.
And this is the one I picture in the heart of the aerobic strength phase.
Right.
Like we were talking, there's different versions we use in different places. And this one's I'm picturing like one, I wanted to say earlier, like if someone only associated it with aerobic strength, like for learning's sake, like that's a good start. Like, it's like good associating it there. And 2, this is the one I picture. Like if you're picturing that, oh, the last time my coach made me run 4 miles at tempo, and I was like, ugh, I want any other workout.
Right.
You probably got that,
Yeah.
in the middle of your training.
Well, and this is where, you know, I've heard you use the terminology fidgety pace or fidgety effort. And I think this is maybe a good time to bring that up. You know, tempo is kind of that fidgety place. So why do you call it the fidgety effort or fidgety pace?
I think it even kind of makes sense in the way that you described, like you have AT down to LT, and then like that there's this range, and right in the middle is where things like like all things in life, you realize like you're kind of working and that you have to concentrate, but you're not in like you don't get the joy of a full out like just go to the well and find the limit and then stop, kind of like in a sprint or closing 200 or something, that sharp, fast, like satisfying feel. Neither do you have the relaxed, like I'm out here forever, and if my friend wants another mile or two, we're jogging easy pace, so I'm there for it. You don't feel the pleasure of either end. You're just right in that controlled space, so you feel the pride of being in control, like you can manage it, but also the frustration that you have to be in control and manage it. So it gets you fidgety. You just either want to speed up and be done, or for me that word is fidgety. Maybe people have other words, but it's just unsettled.
Yeah, because and I think it's a common thing for, especially in American workout culture, where you want to push hard and you want to find the edge, and so there's a temptation to do that for a lot of people, no matter where they are. Or you want to be comfortable. You know, like those are the kind of places we like to live, either pushing hard and on the edge, or comfortable. And this is in the middle of that. You know, it's beyond the edge of comfortable, but not quite to the edge of effort. You shouldn't really be pushing against the edge of effort. You should be in a place where you're able to sustain it for at least a window of time. And that's that middle zone between those two things, you know, that is hard, not only physically, because again, you want to kind of push for one or the other, but also mentally. It's like, oh, am I in control? Am I not in control? Am I relaxed? Am I in the right space? And so it's fidgety, which is, I think, a good term for it. And it takes practice. But this is the most commonly given, I think, prescribed tempo run. I mean, growing up in the sport, I remember people just talking about that and prescribing that. It's like, oh, you're doing 20 or 30 minutes tempo or 3 to 4 miles tempo. Like that's just boom, like here, hand that out like candy. Like it's just a bread and butter workout. So anyway, so that's true tempo, type number 1. All right. Then the second type, true tempo, first type, second type, broken tempo. This is basically where you take something like a true tempo run, but you just break it into parts, smaller chunks. Could be 5-minute chunks, 8-minute chunks, 10-minute chunks, could be 1 mile chunks, 2 mile chunks. But you're basically breaking it up to make it a little bit easier, a little more manageable, give you a little bit of recovery. And it's often a workout that you use to build into a true tempo type workout. So it's basically just a tempo broken into smaller chunks. And a lot of times we also build those, you know, we'll do 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes as you build into it. So straightforward.
Yep. And I think in a good way. Like I hope people take that in as like, oh yeah, that's simple, I can apply it. And I would say like, if they're trying to figure out like where to place them or how to place them or when to use them, that's where that concept of progression overload helps. So if you know you're aiming at like a big true tempo workout, late stage of aerobic strength, to your point, it can be broken up in so many different ways. Like if you know you're going for 4 miles as the big one or 40 minutes as the big one, then you can break them up to 4 by a mile or 4 by 10 minutes. Or even in the priming phase, you can do a fartlek and it's like 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off at that, but like maybe longer and continuous holds where you're coming in and out of it. So those are just ways by which to introduce tempo before you get to the big boy.
Yep. Yeah, I love a broken tempo near the end of a priming phase, going into an aerobic strength phase as kind of that transition type workout where you're starting to practice that next phase of work, but your intervals aren't so long that it's unmanageable in that early stages of training in the priming phase. So that's broken tempo. Next category would be a mixed kind of workout, tempo workout, where you're doing tempo effort with some other type of intensity as well. In our world, there's kind of 3 classic versions of this workout. The very world famous Michigan workout is one of these, popularized by Ron Warhurst, the University of Michigan track coach for a long time. where he would have people do some sort of road interval at tempo effort, alternating with faster, shorter intervals on the track. And, this can look a bunch of different ways, and you can kind of mix up your paces, and you can do this in a couple of different ways, but it's basically combining tempo with faster track work. Oftentimes the tempo is there to generate some fatigue, to help you or force you into working a little harder on the track to maintain pace, or vice versa. Sometimes the track is there to tire you so that you have to work a little harder at maintaining the tempo effort, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I know you and I both use that particular workout perhaps in slightly different places, but can have potentially, good effects, just used a different way with different fitness building components. So the Michigan, another one we like, is a workout we call the Julia, where you do some sort of fartlek, often a 1-1 or a 2-2 fartlek, hard, easy, 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off as a way to generate fatigue. Then you go into a 20-minute or 30-minute tempo on the back half of that after a little bit of recovery. So you've generated the fatigue from the faster work, and now you've got to hold. So you've got some leg fatigue, and you've got to work a little harder to maintain the tempo effort. So that's another one we like. And then we love hills plus tempo is one of my favorites, where you're doing hill reps added or alternating with tempo 800s or tempo repeats of some variety, or perhaps a continuous tempo out and back. So different ways to do it, but you're basically mixing modalities, and these workouts can show up probably primarily in the aerobic strength or in the race specific phase, because this is starting to get to be a little harder, a little bit more intense work.
Mm-hmm.
But we love to mix things, and you're kind of potentially hitting 2 different aerobic systems at one time. Then lastly, the long tempo. This would be 6 to 10 miles, long tempo efforts. Very sparingly used, I would say, in our training philosophy. This is something that's reserved for someone who's built to it properly, who has experience, who isn't just jumping into it early on in their running career, but is getting to it after having a lot of history with this type of work. Typically, this is going to be used for experienced half marathoners or marathoners, so that they can work on that really long, sustained work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's tricky. It's dangerous. You got to be careful about how you use it, about how you apply it and execute it, so you're not overdoing it, because this is one that can easily be a hammer, when you need something a little gentler.
Yeah. I'm glad you said it was more associated with experience and more rarely used, in the sense of like the words in my head where you got to earn the right to do this one. So we don't throw it out as like everybody use this. And I don't want to use language like earn the right, meaning we're gatekeeping or anything like that. It's more of a just recognize that it's longer. Therefore, you're under the cooker longer. It's higher stress. And so just make sure you're ready for that stress load, and that it came in a sequential ordering of things, as opposed to thinking, because I wanted to say like, those that are incorporating these and doing these, that ability to hold pace late stage just adds another level of strength to it. But sometimes presenting it that way will make people be like, oh, I'm going to go do the new 6 to 10 mile tempo, long tempo, and I'm going to use that in every one of my programs. And it's like, no. It's more of like, once you've arrived at that stage where you need that extra stimulus, and then you get that extra stimulus, that's sometimes the difference between people, running crazy world-class paces and holding on in the final miles, because they've just built their system up that high,
Yep. And speaking of world-class paces, I also want to use this as an opportunity to delineate and differentiate. Some people would say, oh, this is a type of workout that's reserved for the quote elite. And that's where I think it's important to differentiate our philosophy and say, no, this is reserved for experienced athletes, because you might be defined as elite and not be able to handle a long tempo. You might break yourself if you went that far, because you weren't experienced at that kind of workout or experienced at that kind of volume of quality. But there's going to be people throughout our spectrum of paces that have the experience to do something like this, that might not be quote elite, but have built up to doing this type of work, and therefore can then find the the finer edges of their potential as a result. So this to me is kind of one of those things where it's important to differentiate how the elite coaches might sort of reserve this for only a certain amount of people or certain people that can run certain paces. It's like, no. It's actually more about experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because there can be some really fast elites or pro runners who couldn't handle this without hurting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one example of how we kind of differentiate and truly believe that elite training is accessible for all if you're willing to build to it. All right, so those are the 4 types. I think it was important to kind of go through those because now we're going to talk about where do these fit. And we're just going to talk about the 4 primary phases of work. I know there's recovery phase is that 5th phase, but we're going to talk about the 4 leading up to it and how you might use tempo effort in each of those phases. We've already touched on it a little bit, but starting with priming. Remember, priming is our word for base phase. Those words can be used interchangeably. It's you're building your volume, you're doing strides, you're potentially working in some light speed workouts in order to prime the body for the work to come. And tempo can be used here. You've already given one example, like a fartlek style version where you might be doing 3 minutes on at tempo, alternating with some time period of easy running. But how would you use tempo effort in priming?
I would use it in that manner. So to build on that, it's like maybe I start with like a 3-3 fartlek, but I'm also gonna in the priming phase consider what other workouts we've done. So I'm always gonna consider them in relationship to other workouts. So, if in the base and priming phase we have like 6 to 8 weeks to play with, and I've already got some 200, 400s, couple steady state runs laid down, then yeah, that 3-3 might sound like a nice middle ground where I put it in mile repeats, but it's 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off until the mile's up, or 2 mile repeats. So again, at this point, because there's so much variety, I want to put it in language like there's so many ways you can use it, whether it's broken up in miles, by 10-minute segments, 2 by 20 minutes, etc. 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off within 1 or 2 mile segments. The thing to take from that is that you're considering what the athlete needs in the priming phase and what you're preparing for in the aerobic strength. So that's how I determine whether or not I'm going to have them do 5 minutes on or with 3 minutes off, or 2 minutes on with 2 minutes off, or just simple like 4 by 1 mile at tempo. I'm going to consider like weather, what I'm preparing them for, what other workouts I'm using surrounding the tempo in the priming phase. And then also like I'm thinking of group training, obviously, with that run of thoughts. On the individual level, it's kind of where they're at. So,
Yep.
The first one being on the lighter end to find out how it went, and then you could progress from there.
Yeah, and the thing I think to remind people there is that it's like, what are you priming for? That's one question. Also, who are you priming?
Mm-hmm.
So those two things kind of come together to figure out what priming workouts are used. And, this is just one potential thing in the quiver, often in the form of a broken tempo is typically what shows up in priming, where maybe you want something, just to give some examples about why you might apply this in the priming phase. Maybe you want something that isn't very fast because you need something that can give somebody a dose that's submaximal before they get to 5K or 10K efforts, even in short intervals with plenty of recovery. Maybe they need something submaximal in order to prime themselves for that work to come. And so it could be an entry workout to working towards that. There are also things it's like, okay, well, maybe somebody needs to learn how to execute tempo, meaning they don't need necessarily the full, true tempo at this stage in the game. Maybe that's coming later, but they need the opportunity to practice that effort and find it and work on it, multiple times in a workout like fartlek style you're talking about, so that later they can come back and recreate that when the stakes are higher, when the work is more important. And so it's a way to learn how to execute tempo as well, but you're priming that for something that's to come. And so those are, just two examples of how you apply those questions. What are we priming for? Meaning, what's the ultimate goal race? And two, who are we priming?
Mm-hmm.
And then this can kind of fit into that. But there could also be priming phases where you don't have any tempo work, right? Because maybe, the person you're priming doesn't need it, or the thing you're priming for, it's less relevant. So a couple of nuances and examples there, but yeah, mostly in priming, just to reiterate, broken tempos are typically what shows up there with time-based intervals or even distance-based intervals. I love a good 4x1 mile broken tempo with 2 minutes recovery late in a priming phase if I need someone to prepare for a true tempo to come, as an example. So those are a couple of examples, but I do think it's important, and that's why we do this podcast, that you don't just, if you're listening, you don't just apply things blindly. You try to take the rationale we're trying to teach and say, hey, does this work for me? Is this something that's important for this phase of work and this time and for my background, et cetera? Because it's not cookie cutter necessarily. It's about understanding the why so that you can apply it for the how. Okay, that's priming. Strength phase. Obviously, this is the bread and butter. This is when tempo workouts are kind of most often used because we're building aerobic strength specifically, working on endurance. True tempo obviously is going to show up here probably most commonly. We love a good mixed workout in this phase, particularly once you've gotten through maybe a true tempo or a broken tempo and you're primed. So it might be later in the aerobic strength phase you're using a mixed workout. Like I like to use the Michigan here. I know you use Michigan more in the aerobics in the race specific phase. I love a Julia workout in the strength phase where you're mixing up a fast fartlek with 20 minutes tempo. And I love hills plus tempo because that's kind of the perfect aerobic strength workout in my mind. But a lot of mixed tempo and true tempo would show up here. And for the perhaps occasional high experienced person, a long tempo.
Yeah. And then also here, I'm just thinking still I'm using progression to guide me, progressing towards what and progressing who we're progressing back to the nice way you set that up. So yeah, you might have a couple through this phase, or you might have like let's say a 2x2 mile early, a true tempo at the end, and then a mixed interval in the middle, or the true tempo in the middle and the mixed interval at the end, depending on how you tweak the mixed interval. If you're putting your faster paces, like you could use the Michigan where you're using fast track work and longer holds at tempo, towards the end before you're converting into race specific. So it's all about like that how you employ it starts to matter in the aerobic strength phase, and how you order them is all I'm saying.
Yep. And to me, the nice thing is, I think old school training would have just had you just do true tempos, and be like, all right, we're just going to throw in a true tempo every week. So for some people back in the day, or every other week. But, with these different options, you can not only mix it up for your own mental variety, but also work on multiple systems, work on a little bit more nuance, build experience with executing different paces, even in this phase, even as we're still mainly focused on aerobic strength building. So we've got that variety potential entering here. And that really carries into the race specific phase, where a lot of these can carry over too, especially for those training for half marathon distance. Tempo effort for a lot of people, again, is about half marathon pace. So you might see tempo style workouts show up more as race pace workouts for half marathoners in the race specific phase. But there may also be reasons to use half marathon pace for a marathoner in race specific phase. For example, we might use an in and out workout or a mixed workout where somebody's alternating half marathon pace and marathon pace in the race specific phase for a marathoner so that they can learn to recover at marathon pace off of that faster half marathon pace. And again, that might be closely associated with tempo effort. So again, you can use it in different ways carrying into the race specific phase. Then it just becomes more specific. And also that question of what are we using it for becomes paramount, because you want to make sure that you're applying it in a way that directly ties to race specific execution in some way.
And I would say if you know enough about your race course, then you can get even really dialed in with it in ways to use it in the race specific phase. Like they're like even Boston itself, like with where hills are. And so if it's the full marathon, you're still surging, like you're still your legs are taking a lot of like beating up and lactates rising through, Newton Hills. So, if you were setting up some kind of workout where you want people to be able to deal with that, you can put tempo into the race specific phase in that way. I'm just saying you can get tailored to the course itself.
Yeah, so that's race specific. And this is, again, sometimes where those long tempos will show up, particularly for a half marathon block for that experienced runner. And then in the taper, it can show up as well. We mention it more as a sort of footnote in the book that in the taper phase, particularly as you get close to race day, you might use it in that window as well. One of my favorite race week workouts, kind of two that I use depending on the situation, is a 2-3 fartlek. 2 minutes on at tempo, alternating with 3 minutes easy. 5 to 6 rounds of that race week. Love that for a half marathoner. Love it for a marathoner because it allows you hidden effort that isn't necessarily directly tied to a pace. So you're not having to worry about what the pace is. You're just going out, you're moving, you're going by feel, you're getting that sanity workout in, but not in a way that can mess with your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love a good kind of tempo fartlek on race week as well. So it can apply there, even going through that taper phase of training. So that's the where. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about the how to execute. We'll end here because all of this is easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the challenge with tempo effort is that it can be easy because it's hard to find that rhythm and it takes experience. It can be easy to screw up, meaning you can waste time trying to hit tempo if you're going too hard or maybe you're not quite going hard enough. And so let's talk a little bit about the how. So we were talking about fidgety pace earlier. In your mind, when you're executing a tempo workout, how do you manage that fidgety kind of tension in your brain?
So what's interesting is I think and I'm going to speak to a true tempo here.
Yep.
But a true tempo workout in the heart of the aerobic strength phase, I want to be careful here because I don't want to be contributing to confusion. When we're talking about it physiologically and what it does, we're putting it in the aerobic strength phase primarily, even though we talked about how it fits into everything else. But how it fits into everything else starts to turn into language you use. And so from a physiological standpoint, the true tempo, I will tell myself I'm doing this workout because my body needs that stimulus so it can learn to recycle lactate and I'm more efficient going forward, right? But psychologically and mentally, what I'm doing is I think that is great race day training, specifically marathon and half, really any distance when you really get into the sport. But marathon and half for me, in the sense that it's such a control game. Like if you really want a PR, everything about the day comes with forms of control. We all want to get to the unbridled stage where we're racing away at the end, but it's like first you're like calming yourself and you're running paces that feel crazy easy, and then you're moving into something a little bit more specific and controlled, but it's by no means challenging. And then you get into later miles in these races, and that's when it starts to feel like a tempo workout, right? So me, mentally, I'm telling myself, this is what it takes to become a marathoner. Like this is marathon training. This is race day training. Like we're in it for the long game. So I'm actually visualizing race day during these, even though physiologically we're using it in the middle sections of the training.
Yep.
I think it's amazing mindset training for how controlled you have to be throughout so much of your race day experience.
So you're thinking about that staying power on race day, probably also bringing in the mental tools you use to execute on race day, which I think is, by the way, as a side note, a great opportunity to bring in your mental training to training so that you're not just practicing that when you race, but using mantras. Like I love, just to camp on that on a second, is I love using and practicing my, what I call rhythm mantras, or the words I'm going to use, the phrases I'm going to use to stay in that calm, controlled rhythm. And that's when you can start to put them to work in a tempo workout to find that groove. Because if we're using language, some people are like, oh, well, how am I going to know if I'm hitting the effort? And so there's various ways, and measuring lactate's the only real way to know. But we use words. So the words I use are, you want to be noticeably working hard, meaning you're working, but you're in total control over that work. And recognizing that there's a spectrum from aerobic threshold to lactate threshold with tempo in the middle. We usually talk about aerobic threshold as comfortably hard, meaning, yeah, you're working, but you're comfortable, and you can, in the moment, feel like you could hold it almost forever. Tempo in the middle, you're working, but you're in control. And you wouldn't call it comfortable because it's not. It's past comfortable, but it's still in control. Then lactate threshold is working and on the edge of control, meaning you still got it, but you're close to falling off the edge, right? And so those are words I use to describe. And so part of this is just practice and executing. And we like to tell people, don't judge yourself. If you go do a tempo workout and you come back and you're like, shoot, I went too hard. Okay, don't be mad about it. Don't be frustrated with yourself, but rather just say, all right, what can I learn? Review the data, review your heart rate, review how it felt. Think about next time, what are you going to do to try to find that zone? And so it's all just a process of learning, because even the most experienced runners like myself can screw up a tempo workout because it's hard to find that rhythm, especially as the weather variables change, which we talked about last week. So those are some other things to use. A couple of other tips I like to use. One is progression. To me, this is a classic John Schrupp move. It's like finding tempo. You want to start a little slower than it. Maybe start at aerobic threshold for the first bit and kind of work towards finding it. And as you work towards that, you're going to be able to feel how it's changing, how the effort's changing and evolving. And hopefully as a part of that, find out where the middle rhythm is. But if you go too hard and regress, then that's more challenging, right? So always err on the conservative side, and you can always inch forward, right? That to me is one of the key ways to find tempo. Another thing that I like to talk about, the second tip I would give here, is staying present. There's something about people, especially type A folks that want to do this stuff and learn about it, is when we overshoot, we tend to stay there. Like, oh, well, crap, I overshoot. I'm already going X pace. I know that's too fast, but I'm just going to try to hang and hold there. Instead of being present and saying, no, okay, wait, I overshot. I'm clearly going too hard. I'm going to recognize that in the moment. I'm going to back off in the moment, find a different rhythm, and then reset. I think staying present with these workouts is so, so important, because if you screw it up in the moment, you realize, wait, this is too hard. Then don't wait till the next workout to fix it. Fix it right then. Recognize it, stay present, pull back till you're in control again. And then if you find that rhythm again, you can press always a little more. So just be present with it, which is so much easier said than done, but is so important to finding this rhythm, because it gets tricky.
Yeah. And there's going to be moments. That's why I like thinking of race day when doing them, because there's going to be moments in race day where you overshoot the mark, or you got caught up racing with someone, or maybe you weren't racing them. You just found a rhythm that was like a clip to each other's cadence, and you're just like locked for a little while. Or if it's like in the pro and elite circuit where they're actually practicing surges, and then they have to resettle. It's like there's either like surges that happen in a race, you maybe not surging with a pack, but like you're got caught up with someone, or you came through some hills and you feel the leg tightness and you have to back off a little and reset and readjust. It's like, if you haven't been practicing paying attention like that and learning how to kind of like find where you are and regain strength and then move back into it, then on race day, yeah, you'll just run until you hit a wall, and then bam, it blows up and explodes. Right. Instead of being able to make real-time, smart, wise adjustments, let the body adjust and then get back to rhythm.
Yeah, and as you're doing that, once you find the groove, then the real magic can begin, where you're practicing consciously relaxing into it, trying to make it feel even easier. You know, find that groove, then try to make it feel easier. Instead of pressing the edge, relax into it. That's where the real magic is. And that involves thinking about your breathing and making that smooth and rhythmic, thinking about your tension through your whole body, relaxed face, relaxed shoulders, relaxed arms, relaxed legs, thinking consciously about your heart rate, making it sort of a moving meditation. If you can do that, then you'll find suddenly that you settle into perhaps an even easier rhythm, which may not in the moment allow you to increase the pace at which you're hitting tempo effort. But the next time you do the workout, you might actually be able to go faster at the same effort because you've learned to relax into it. So that's the real skill we're working on. And it correlates so well to staying power in races, because ultimately in a half and a full, the game is how can I be as relaxed as I can be as long as I can at pace. And you can practice that in these types of workouts. The other thing you mentioned, which brought a thought to the brain, was if you're doing it with other people, a tempo workout is a great workout to do with other people, especially people that are of similar pace or ability as you, because then you can find a rhythm together. But there's an art and a magic to doing that and to finding a rhythm together, because sometimes you'll get in groups where people are racing each other, you know, where they're kind of one-stepping or half-stepping each other, and you suddenly end up going too fast because everybody's kind of pushing each other, versus when you get shoulder to shoulder with somebody and you start to sync up, and then you fall into a rhythm together. And then you're able to, because of that mutual rhythm, make your rhythm feel even easier, because there's something about that energy between two people at this type of effort that makes it smooth, easier, go pass quickly. You know, and I can think of a handful of training partners in my head from the past that, you know, if I'm doing a workout, I would love to have them by my side, because we were able to find that synergy together. But you're not fighting each other, you're syncing up.
You're working with each other.
Yeah, and that's, you know, again, easier said than done, and it takes some practice. But it's so important to think about that consciously and talk about it with your training partner, so you guys aren't turning it into a race. So those are a couple of notes on execution. Would you add anything else?
Not on execution. No.
Anything else broadly that we've missed?
Not that we missed, but I think I want to re-highlight, and it's in the book too, so I'd encourage people to read it in the book and or at the very least go back to the part where you talked about the AT window and the LT window and what's going on scientifically, or what's going on in the bloodstream, like you're accumulating lactate, because one, I think when you understand that that's happening, you sort of embrace the fidgety feel. You kind of know, like, oh, well, of course, like my body's actually working and converting and recycling, and I'm developing this efficiency here, so that's why I need it, A. But B, I just like to emphasize that once you know that, it starts to become obvious that, like, even other workouts that may not be titled the tempo workout, you're still getting those similar benefits at times. So there's going to be times where you might see a coach, like, you know, and I do a workout sometimes called the 1864, where it's a cut down of 1,000, 800, 600, 400, and it's so similar to a progression pace run. It's just that it has standstill recoveries. And so there might be a primary benefit to one of those descending ladders that I just described. But even with the recoveries, it's not the same as a true tempo or a tempo, but lactate's still rising in the bloodstream, and you're still having to convert it back into energy. And so there's going to be times where coaches might sneak things in and kind of help you get some of those physiological benefits, even if it isn't titled true tempo in the way we described it.
Right.
Well, we described it in a lot of ways today, so hopefully
Yeah,
we hit it from enough angles.
In a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, again, goes back to just that mentality around staying power. I think a lot of us think that if we're not suffering or hurting enough, then it doesn't work. But these types of workouts really within this threshold range between the two thresholds, it's all about staying power. It's all about relaxing at pace. It's all about being more efficient. And so, yeah, you're going to be in a tempo run, and you're going to be able to run faster if you want to. Like, we're not trying to work faster paces or efforts. We're trying to work a certain one. And so just because you can go faster off of tempo effort doesn't mean you should. And instead, of thinking about going faster, which is the temptation of many, you should rather try to make that given effort or pace feel even easier. And that's where the real magic is. And I don't think that mentality of efficiency in our sport is talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a tricky thing to wrap your head around, but it's a real benefit when you get it, when you
Mm-hmm.
find it, when you say, oh, I see now what relaxing can do to making things feel so much easier. All right. I think we can wrap it up. That's a whole episode on tempo workouts. Next week, we're talking about long runs. So we're kind of taking in this section of the book, we're taking the subcomponents of training and drilling into them a little bit further, this being chapter 16 on tempo work. And with that, we can wrap it up. But a couple of reminders first. One, perfect time to join Rogue Training because we are gearing up our training right now as we speak across in-person and virtual outlets for fall races from really Sydney in August all the way to CIM in December. And of course, if you're training for something beyond that, we can help you now too. But if you want to join us, check us out at roguerunning.com. You can also email us, coaching@roguerunning.com, if you just want to cut straight to the chase and get the right recommendation for what you're looking for. And then also a reminder, on Fridays at 2 p.m. Central Time, we go live on Instagram at Rogue Running and at Rogue Chris to answer questions live from you. Might be listeners, might be followers, but we get great questions every week. We spend about 30, 40 minutes answering your questions. So if you have questions on this or about your training in any capacity, come on live with us on Friday at 2 p.m. Central, and we'll answer those things. And lastly, of course, just follow us on Instagram at Rogue Running. Check out the website if you're curious about what we do. But if you're training for a goal of any variety, we are here to help you. And now is a good time to jump in. All right, we'll wrap it here. Go get your runs done, and we'll talk to you next week.